Okay, now for more on those latest trade numbers and China's economy as a whole, I'm joined by Neysun Mahboubi. He is a research scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania's Ronald Perelman Center for Political Science and Economics. That's a mouthful. I hope I got that name right as well.
It's perfect.
Okay, great. Let's move on to this because there's a lot to cover. Now, what was behind the decline in China's exports? And I'm curious what you think of Premier Li's assessment of China's labor market.
Well, in terms of the decline in exports generally, I think it's probably hard to disassociate from the trade tensions with the United States over the past few years. And we know that the tariffs are still high. They may come down at some point in the near future by some of the reporting, but that certainly contributes. But beyond that, certainly I think the effects of China's approach to the COVID-19 pandemic, the ways in which it's disrupted supply chains, certainly are playing a role. And lastly, one would imagine that the war in Ukraine and the ways in which sanctions have been levied on Russia by the United States and its Western allies and partners, and the ways in which Chinese companies are abiding by those sanctions so far are all contributing to that overall picture. In terms of Premier Li's remarks, I think a lot of people noticed them. They were reported here in the United States by Bloomberg. They're very interesting. And I interpret them, honestly, as being somehow maybe conveying some of the policy disagreements at the highest levels of the Chinese government about how to proceed vis-a-vis the pandemic right now. I think the costs of Chinese COVID-19 mitigation strategies, the economic costs, are becoming very clear. And it's quite plausible to me that there's a lot of differences of opinion at the highest levels of the government about what's the best way to proceed.
It is certainly uncharted territory, but I want to get back to the policy. And you're talking about zero tolerance policy. And there's been a lot of discussion about that. We had the severe lockdowns in Shenzhen and, of course, in Shanghai. And that's certainly going to affect China's economy and therefore affect the whole global economy as a whole. What about this strict COVID policy? Do you see China in some way readdressing the way they're looking at this? Or if it continues to go on and they have these outbreaks over and over, that certainly is not going to be good for the economy.
Well, I think there are two big problems here. The first is, ironically, that China is in some ways the victim of its own success in combating the pandemic in its first 2 years. As we all know, the Chinese government adopted policies towards the pandemic after some months after the pandemic became apparent in Wuhan that proved to be a lot more effective than the approaches that were taken in other countries, including here in the United States. And so I think there's a danger here of having succeeded at an earlier stage of the pandemic, having some difficulty to readjust now under some new conditions, especially in light of all the things that have helped to mitigate the pandemic in other countries, including vaccinations and the like. So one issue is simply that having succeeded already, it's hard to get over that initial sense of success. The second is that as a consequence of the Chinese approach to the COVID-19 pandemic, there's an entire bureaucracy, an entire set of mobilization that has come into being, and that's also got its own path dependency, and it's hard to just shut that down. So I think it would take real leadership to readjust now based on new conditions.
Neysun, I also want to take a look at the fact that China had such meteoric growth, really was the engine that drove the global economy for such a long time. Now, how has the situation changed in China, and how is this slowdown affecting global recovery?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly the fact that China did manage to handle a pandemic better in its first couple of years contributed a lot to its ability to be that engine for global economic growth during the first 2 years of the pandemic. Now, the situation is different. And whether or not China can adjust is not just a question that matters for Chinese within China, because we live in an interdependent global economy. It's going to affect all of us. So I think, if there are supply chain issues in some factory in some part of China, we're going to feel it here in the United States and other parts of the world. And so I think it's the kind of thing where it makes sense for people around the world to be concerned about what the next steps are going to be within the Chinese economic landscape.
I could talk to you on and on, but unfortunately we are out of time. But I'd love to have you back again. Neysun Mahboubi, research scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania's Ronald Perelman Center for Political Science and Economics. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.